On August 24th, 1814, British soldiers marched into Washington, D.C., and began burning the city to the ground. When all was said and done, the White House, Capitol Building, Treasury, and other government buildings were left in ruin. 1812 and the years preceding it were exciting, chaotic, and dangerous for the United States. With such a new nation, great empires held little regard for the small country. Embroiled in bitter fighting with Napoleon Bonaparte, the English attempted to blockade any trade coming from the United States to France. Impressment, or the Royal Navy forcing U.S. men on merchant vessels to serve the British Empire, also served to increase tensions between America and their former sovereign. Further efforts by the British to encourage Native American hostilities led to individuals like Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun to call for war. Finally, on June 18, 1812, under increased pressure by many, the country had declared war against Great Britain. By August 1814, the war had been going for 2 years, and neither side had much success over the other. The earlier part of the war was focused in North America and Canada, and mostly consisted of smaller British forces, as the majority of the army was still mostly engaged in European wars. On April 1814, Napoleon had been defeated, and so the full attention of the British Empire was able to be applied to the conflict in the West. Greater focus on the war, as well as a recent burning of the Canadian capital of York, had upset the British greatly and led them to make greater efforts to weaken the United States. In retaliation for York, a force was dispatched to attack cities including Baltimore and Washington, D.C. In Washington itself, Mayor James Haig Blake reached out to President Madison and insisted on building defenses for the weak city. Raids in Leonardtown, Maryland, continued to exacerbate feelings of dread for those in the Chesapeake Bay and in Washington, D.C. On July 28th, in response to these anxieties, a crowd gathered outside the president's house and said they would prevent President Madison from leaving the city. By August 17th, the British fleet had anchored at the Patuxent River and began working their way toward the capital city. One Lewis Macon worked to save the records that were present at the U.S. Capitol building. Commandeering a wagon, Macon loaded it with all the documents he felt were of any value. When the wagon was completely full, he left the capital like many others. Macon headed towards a family farm in Maryland where he hoped the documents would be safe. On the way to the state, his wagon overturned and caused many papers to spill out. With the papers regathered, Macon was finally able to arrive at the family farm. Although the documents were now safe, it would take another 5 years for the documents to return to the capital. On August 24th, the British marched to Bladensburg. 5,000 militiamen and 500 regulars of the United States were defeated by the British force numbering 4,500. Using rockets, the British were able to cause chaos and force a rout of U.S. troops. From there, the way to the capital was open for the British. Meanwhile, Madison had returned to the president's mansion and found the First Lady had already departed. Dolly Madison, on her departure, had taken several items like a portrait of President Washington and other artifacts to keep them from destruction. Back at the White House, and troubled by Bladensburg, Madison was only able to drink a glass of wine before fleeing the capital himself. On the evening of August 24th, 1814, the British entered Washington, D.C., mostly unopposed, and began burning buildings to the ground. British Admiral George Cockburn ordered his men to burn the White House, Capitol Building, and Treasury to the ground. Residential buildings and the U.S. Patent Office were saved a similar fate, the administrator of the Patent Office saying any document or invention lost would be a loss to humanity. The next day, August 25th, the building still burned until a storm rolled in and put out the fires. Unfortunately, a tornado or hurricane tore through the city. The city was only occupied 36 hours before the British ultimately left for Baltimore. The burning of Washington, D.C. left many early buildings in the capital a ruin. The Capitol building itself was a burned-out shell. Marble had melted to lime, and according to Benjamin Lestrobe, was left a most magnificent ruin. Other losses of the burning included 3,000 volumes of rare books and a massive statue of an eagle. In general, the burning was seen as a great embarrassment, but one that would rally the nation for the rest of the war. Upon arriving in Baltimore after the burning, the British were met with a well-defended city. The Battle of Fort McHenry was a great victory, and led to the poem titled Defense of Fort McHenry, which later became the Star-Spangled Banner. The rest of the war would also result in several victories. Finally, on December 24th, the Treaty of Ghent was signed and the war was over. 15 days later, a victory in New Orleans cemented the idea in many Americans' minds that the war had been a victory. The ruined Capitol was quickly rebuilt. The new White House was complete and in operation in 1817, and the Capitol building would be in operation by 1819.